All right, so hi, Gareth and all divers around the world. Um, Time for another webinar. I can see we've already got a couple of early birds there, so I think shall we get right to it? I've got a couple of slides just to sort of get things started, and then I'll hand over to you, Gareth. Yeah, is that fine? Okay, let me just add my part there. All right. Well, there we go. Well, good evening, everybody. Time for another webinar. I hope that you're all keen, ready, and looking forward to it. So, yeah, just welcome to all the Dive Nation folks out there. It's great to have you join another Supercharged Dan webinar. For those folks that don't know me, my name is Morne Christo. I'll be the host this evening, and I'm also the CEO of Dan Southern Africa. Just thank you for making time to join the webinar. And thank you for supporting Divers Alert Network, which helps build a safer dive community. Now, our talk topic this evening is one mistake and you're dead isn't how accidents happen. So quite a controversial topic, but one that I'm looking forward to. And Gareth will explore that with us. So I hope you're ready, got your refreshments and your snacks ready. Just a couple of webinar basics before we kickstart the presentation. As usual, your video and mic is turned off for the presentation. And if you have any comments before the webinar starts, use the comments box. Tell us who you are, where you are in the world, and if you have any expectations. And during the presentation, if you have any questions, please use the comments box, but use hashtag ask and then your questions so that we can identify the questions from the general comments out there. And then between myself and Gareth, we'll do our best to address those. Now, as usual, the webinar replay will be available via the Dan Southern Africa YouTube channel. And you'll also receive a follow-up email with a replay link, and there'll be a bunch of free resources and links to some of the information that we'll be discussing this evening. All right, so just again, thank you for supporting Divers Alert Network. If you haven't joined yet, you can always join today. The best place to learn about Divers Alert Network would be via the website. So you can find out about what Dan does, the resources we have, and if you'd like to know about the packages we offer. If you're in the Southern Africa region, you can go to our website, which is dansa.org. If you find yourself in the United States, you can go to dan.org. In Europe, you can go to daneurope.org. And if you find yourself in Asia Pacific, danap.org. So to all the active Dan members, thank you for your ongoing support. And if any of you would like to help us grow our YouTube channel, we do have a sort of a type of donation feature available via the YouTube comments section. It's called Super Chat. It's, depending on which device you are, it's at the bottom, a little $ type of icon. If you click on that, you can select a Super Chat or a Super Sticker, and you can donate, any amount that you feel, small, big, whichever. So if you go that route, thank you very much for supporting the channel. Now, something just before we kickstart the webinar, tomorrow and the day after, it is the Human Factors in Diving Conference that Gareth has put together. And each day there's a bunch of different international speakers that'll be talking on a variety of topics related to diving, diving safety, and so much more. It's really worthwhile attending this. And if you haven't got a ticket yet, why not scan that code now? It'll take you to the web page that talks about the conference, what it's about. And from that page, you can actually purchase your ticket for the conference. Now, it is an online conference, and Gareth will talk more about how it's structured and how it'll work a little bit later on. But what's nice is he's actually structured a variety of different tickets. So you can actually attend the live event, or you can buy a ticket for the live event and the recordings, or just the recording. So there's a variety of options available and really worthwhile attending. So if you don't have your ticket yet, or you don't know about the conference, use that QR code and read up on that and purchase your tickets and get ready for tomorrow and the day after. All right. Well, as usual, for attending the webinar, I've got a free Dan gift for you. And this is a must-have Dan Smart Guide. It's on how to avoid running out of air. Now, if you don't have this guide yet, very easy to get hold of it. You can just scan that QR code. That'll open up your WhatsApp application with a pre-populated message and pretty much just ask you for, or it'll state that you're looking for the guide. And all you need to do is just add your name there, and I'll then send you a link to download the presentation. So yeah, just scan the code, open up your WhatsApp application, add your name, and I'll send you a link to download that guide. All right, so while you're on the Dan Southern Africa YouTube channel, if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe to the channel. It'll help us grow our dive community on YouTube, and it'll help YouTube to promote the channel to other like-minded divers out there. And while if you got some dive buddies out there, you might as well share this broadcast with them so that we can actually get a nice footprint on YouTube for this presentation. And then, wait until the end of the talk, see if you like it, give us a thumbs up, thumbs down, or a love, so that we can help share this content with more divers around the world. So please subscribe if you haven't done that just yet. All right, so let's meet our guest speaker this evening. It's Gareth Locke from the Human Diver. So who is Gareth? Well, he's been involved with or in high-risk work since 1989. He has spent 25 years in the Royal Air Force in a variety of frontline operational research and development and systems engineering roles, which has given him a unique perspective. Now, in 2005, he started his dive training with Buggy and is now an advanced trimix diver and JJCCR Moxic trimix diver. Now, in 2016, he formed the Human Diver with the goal of bringing his operational human factors and system thinking to diving safety. All right, so if you don't know Gareth yet, visit his website. You'll find out all the courses and books and things that he's doing. Now, a quick topic overview before I hand over to Gareth. One mistake and you're dead isn't how accidents normally happen. Now, this phrase is often used to get people to pay attention to the hazards they face while undertaking a dive, especially a rebreather dive. Now, if you don't pay attention and you make a mistake, then you're dead. It's usually the message. So the problem is that accidents don't happen like this, and as a consequence, we start to drift from acceptable behavior. Now, the focus of the webinar will be on the numerous factors, cognitive biases, and personal peer influences that contribute to an unintended outcome, rather than the singular mistake or root cause that is often attributed to a fatal event. So prepare to have your thoughts challenged on accident casualties. So I hope, well, that's a mouthful, but it's really an interesting concept. And over to Gareth. So let's get started. Gareth, let me just stop sharing my screen and present your slides. Over to you, Gareth.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Mornay. And it's great. I mean, yes, I did use some long words, and I'm sorry in there. And probably one of the most important bits that was a sort of a tongue twister is the difference between casualty and causality. So actually, the final bit is, I'm going to challenge your thoughts about incident, accident, causality. And the first couple of slides are really going to get you thinking. So the phrase came up because after I'd put this documentary, If Only, together, I was reading some comments and they said, oh yeah, well, I used to be involved in rebreathers when they were coming in the early sort of late 1990s, and got involved in them and then realized that these things were potentially dangerous. And if you make one mistake, you're dead. You've got to have that mindset that this rebreather is trying to kill you. And it's like, it's not like that at all. A rebreather is an inanimate object. It is doing what the logic in the controller is programmed to do, which is the partial pressure in the breathing loop what it's being commanded to do? So if the partial pressure is lower than the controller's set point is, it will inject oxygen. If it is higher, well, it'll just wait until you consume it. If it gets too high, it'll give you some indication by the head-up display or the controller. If it's too low, it'll give you some indication from the head-up display and the handset controller. It is not trying to kill you. The engineers have designed it to try and keep you alive. It's, they've got a vested interest in this as well. So the bit as well is this concept that we look at something that's obvious and it's invariably the last person to touch it. And this is where aviation was, in the sort of 70s and 80s, where it was just this pilot error. The pilot was the last person to touch the aircraft, therefore it was their fault. And it wasn't until they started doing some more digging into systems engineering, looking at examining the cockpit voice recorders and the flight data recorders, they realized that actually there was a lot more to it than would meet the initial eye. And so, this attribution of pilot error, human error, diver error, or just saying it was one mistake, they didn't pay attention, is massively flawed. And that's what I'm going to explore tonight. So to start off with, I'm going to pick something fairly recent in the news. So this is 12 days ago on the BBC News, which is sort of reported the Indian Air Accident Investigation Branch published their report into this Air India Express plane crash. And there were a number of things that came out. And Morne had already touched on the conference. Diane Chadwick-Jones is going to explain a little bit more about this tomorrow at the presentation, but I've got some additional sort of bits here. So, you look at this BBC website page and it says several violations of operational procedures by the pilot. They didn't carry out an adequate briefing, which meant that the cabin crew weren't sat down when they touched down. There was a malfunctioning windshield wiper when they came in for the first approach, which limited their visibility. And they didn't. They also didn't brief what they were going to do in terms of the tailwinds and the rain and the impact that this was going to have. And no pun intended in terms of the impact. Now, this was a really sort of superficial report when it came out to the media, because it is. We often focus on something called the dispositional factors, the individual factors, rather than looking at the wider context. Now, I was at a workshop on Tuesday, and somebody sent me a link to a journalist, an Indian journalist, who'd written a lot more about what had really gone on when they read more details into the Accident Investigation Branch. So, for a start, they were coming in from the Middle East into India at an airfield that's on top of a tabletop. So it's a sort of tabletop area, and it's got steep sides down the sides. Not a particularly long runway. It's only about 8,800 feet, so it's about 1.5 miles long. It's not very long. They were running late, so they only had about 30 minutes to touch down, because if they ran late, the captain was flying the following day, and he would have been out of crew duty, which meant that flight tomorrow would have been cancelled or at least delayed significantly. The visibility wasn't very good. There were thunderstorms in the area. They knew that was going to happen, and they got a diversion, and they talked about coming in and potentially diverting. The runway lighting when they came in was limited. So if you go into big airports, they have a center line set of lighting, and then they have bars that basically give you an indication, give you a better idea of where the center line of the runway was. On this runway, they didn't. They only had edge lighting. So as they're coming down in this poor weather, the inability to identify where they are at the last minute was quite crucial. Now, the point in the accident report said that they didn't calculate the landing distance, and that's something they admitted to do. They were landing in this airfield. It was at higher altitude. The weather was poor. They needed to actually allow 15% more runway distance for what they thought they had, what they thought they were going to calculate to the conditions that were there. So that meant that they really had to land close to the approach end, the threshold end. Now, they made the approach to runway 28, so it's heading 280 into wind, which is where you want to be, because now you've got something that helps you lift, and it also slows the aircraft down. Now, they made the first approach. It was really poor, and they decided to overshoot, which was the right decision. And as they were doing their circling approach to come back round again onto 28, air traffic control said, well, we've just had another aircraft land on 10, which is the one coming the other way. There's only 8 knots of tailwind. So it's 8 knots headwind flying on 28, and it was going to be 8 knots of tailwind when they landed on 10. Now, that's, you don't want to land with a tailwind, but that sort of limit is acceptable. So they decided to make the approach onto runway 10. Now they're flying down their instrument boat landing system. They didn't fly the approach as well as it could have done. And when they came down and they sort of got stabilized height to touch down, they were already 3,000 feet into the 8,800 foot runway. In the past, the captain had been criticized in his training for how to flare the aircraft. So he flared, he landed long, so he landed 4,400 feet. So he's landed halfway down the runway, and bearing in mind, he needs another 15% of what he would normally have to be able to land. They ran off the end of the runway and down an embankment, and both the pilots were killed, and most of the people were on board were killed as well. Now, as I said, there were training issues. The co-pilot seemingly had a weak pulse when the rescue services first got there, but it took another hour to get the pilots out the cockpit because the rescue services didn't know how to open the emergency exits on the aircraft. The doctors and the medics trying to get to the crash site couldn't actually get there because the roads were blocked, even though these had been highlighted in previous reports. So from what on the surface looks like a very simple thing, pilot error, didn't do what they were supposed to do, there are multiple contributory factors that are sort of glossed over when we hear the sort of social media and news narratives. So I'm going to move on to another example. And this is an event that happened after the first Gulf War in northern Iraq. And I was going through my navigator training at RAF Finningley near Doncaster when this happened. And what happened is 2 Black Hawk helicopters were shot down by US Air Force F-15 fighter jets. And people were just sitting there going, how on earth could you have a situation where you've got professionally trained aircrew who have, and were told to go and visually identify these helicopters, which were believed to be Mi-8 Hinds, Mi-24 Hinds, and they flew past them, and they went, "Yep, they're the enemy helicopters," and they went round again and shot them down with missiles. And the investigation was just like, really, what's going on? And there were so many factors that led to this. And this book here that Scott Snook wrote, he created this little sort of mind map of the factors involved that led to the accident and the shoot down in the bottom right-hand side. And he was saying there were just so many things that always start, fall of the Soviet Union, changing world order, there's high operational tempo, there were radios that weren't working, the IFF, identification friendly foe modes weren't working properly. The helicopter teams weren't on the same frequencies that the fast jet guys were on. The AWACS control aircraft had got new crew who weren't working in a consolidated manner. There were so many things that ultimately ended up with total, I think, 26 people on board, all killed. And again, this sort of, really? How could you make such a mistake? And I'm going to touch on a little bit about the sort of decision-making processes there. But there is a phrase that we will see what we want to see, and confirmation bias will confirm that. So we have to be very careful when we look at events. There is this piece that says, how does it make sense for somebody to do what they did? And then moving on to diving is the documentary that I produced with Ashley Buggy, who's the widow of Brian, and the dive team. And that was released in May last year, and the second anniversary of Brian's death. And that tells the story of a rebreather fatality that happened on a rebreather diver training course. And Brian entered the water with his oxygen cylinder turned off. Now, that would be an obvious thing to say, yes, well, that's the mistake. One mistake, you don't turn your oxygen cylinder on, you're going to die. Now, there's a whole bunch of factors, as you'd expect for that sort of scenario. They were rushed in terms of their time, both on the day itself, but also working up to this trip that had been going on. It being kept on rescheduling, they were running late. They potentially, if they couldn't get the course done in time, they were going to have to pay back thousands of dollars to the Veterans Agency, which they got money from to pay for their training and pay for their equipment. So there were a lot of time pressures involved. There were a lot of psychological and peer pressures involved. The instructor was using language like, with all deference to your expertise, as a way of glossing over and shortcutting the lessons. When the lessons were done, when the mistakes were picked up in the exams, they were given the answers to answer rather than explain and learn some more. They were military people that were taking part in the class, and so they felt it was wrong to speak up and challenge their instructor because it's about respect, and you praise in public and you criticize in the quiet, in private. And unfortunately, as Barbara, who was one of the dive team members who gave an interview, said, it's sitting there going, this is not how I was taught as my earlier rebreather training. And I want to say something, but I can't. And hindsight then says, oh, I really should have said something at that stage. But she didn't, and she felt she couldn't because of what was going on. And that peer pressure, that authority gradient is real. And if anybody in here is as an instructor, do not underestimate the power of authority that you have. The perception that you are the perfect diver that doesn't make mistakes, and what you say goes, because your students don't know what they don't know, especially in the recreational area. They will just look at you and go, okay, they're doing that, and I will copy it. So whatever you do, your role modeling then gets transferred onto your students. And that includes simple things like role modeling of doing pre-dive checks. If you don't do it, if you don't get your students to involve you and you involve them in your pre-dive checks to make sure everything's done, they will look on and go, you know what? When you get to be an instructor, you don't get to do checks. You don't have to do checks because you're good enough. Be humble and show people that you make mistakes. And the reason why you do these checks is to trap them. And when those mistakes are trapped, you celebrate them. You don't put them down. So those are sort of three scenarios, different areas that highlight that it's not one single mistake. Even if we like to think that, our brains are wired and say, yes, if it's a single thing, then we can control it. And we love to be in control of the situation. So if I look at a single failure, yeah, I can control that, and I wouldn't make that mistake. But if we start looking at complex systems, we start getting a little bit scared, and you go, I can't control that. I'm never going to be able to control that, so I'll just sort of ignore it. And people go, nah, that isn't how we work. We are quite irrational creatures in hindsight, but totally logical and rational in the real time that goes on, and the mental processes that are involved. So we're going to go through, let's see, a few ideas. This is the one that will probably get people going. A root cause of an accident is our imagination. That's the first topic I'm going to cover. Then we're going to go through how we make decisions, a little bit on biases. I'm going to use a model called the Swiss cheese model. I'm going to talk about different variations of that, and importantly, what the limitations of that model is. What influences us, and then I double click there a little bit quick, sorry, and then take questions. If you've got questions in the as we go along, please, as Mornay said, write them in the chat, put hashtag ask, and then Mornay can pick them up when we come to the session at the end. So this is a blog that I wrote last week because I said I was on a class and with a guy called Nipin Anand, who's a safety consultant and has done some fantastic workshops that I've been on. And we were talking about root cause. And he said, the root cause of an accident is our imagination. And it was just like, wow, that's quite a fundamental piece. And you'll think, no, there are root causes. That's why, we have accident investigation branches, and Mornay and I were just talking about how do agencies and how do organizations manage their own internal investigations. So we can look at different aspects of our imagination. So let's start off with human. You were the last to touch it. So that's the cause of an accident. And this bucket of human error that we throw things into that is completely meaningless when it comes to learning. We could take a technical perspective of this and look at the dive equipment. We look at, say, the regulators or the BCD, or say whether or not people had a knife or a cutting device. It might be about the valve not opening properly when it's been opened and then backed off or whatever. So we have a technical view of why an accident happened and go right back to the start. Rebreathers are trying to kill you. No, they're not. They're an inanimate object that is behaving how it's designed. Social and cultural reasons. Oh, it's peer pressure. Oh, it's that nationality. They're always taking risks. Oh, that training agency are more risk seeking or risk averse than that one over there. So again, we're looking at buckets that we can put things into that explain that. And it could be a single thing. And the Air India crash, there was a comment saying it had a poor safety culture, Air India, the airline. It's like, well, that's not a very, culture is a huge thing. So let's look at, how did that culture develop in the way it did? We could look at organizational pressures and how an organization is set up. And you see so much in the social media. Oh, it's that agency that's causing the problem. Well, agencies are made up of people, and people interact differently when they're in a group as to when they would behave on their own. So the dynamics shift from how you would behave as an individual when you don't have pressures to what happens in a group. And there are some fantastic videos out there in terms of social conformance and what people will do. And once we're inside an organization, we start to take on those attributes, those behaviors, those labels, and we start to protect our own bit. So if somebody criticizes our organization during an investigation, we often get very defensive because it's my tribe. And then finally, we can look at systems and human factors, and a concept that I'll cover, which comes into this, called practical drift, which is where Scott Snook's book was really talking about. Now, effective investigations look at a systems approach or a human factors approach. And the reason why and/or is because human factors takes into account people, organizations, context, environment. It's how individuals interact with the operating environment, the hardware, other people, and we call it software, but it's documentation, rules, regulations, things like that. So it's not just the items that are within the system, it's the interactions and the relationships that exist there as well. So one of the ways, and I can't remember whether or not I've run about 3 or 4 of these for Dan Southern Africa now, but and I will be presenting this on Saturday in my presentation called The Messy World of Diving. Diving is imagined and diving is done. And this comes from a piece of work looking at healthcare and this idea that we have 3 big tensions that exist within any system. We've got the black one, which is about basically how much money have we got? How much can we spend? And this, whilst it's written for healthcare and bigger organizations, you'll see this in your own diving as well. And it's how we factor in certain things. So the black line is about how much money have we got? Can we afford to do what we're doing before we run out of discretionary money, which, diving for most people is a discretionary activity. So we have a small bucket of money available, or we have, organizations' profit and loss. Then we've got the boundary to unacceptable workload. So this is how much effort can I put in? So as an individual, or it's how much as an organization, how many people do we have? And how are we going to get that done? So from that side, we have tensions that basically say, and then on the other side, we've got safety. So we have a hard line, which is we have an accident, and we have this dotted line, which is the perception of where we think an accident is, and that's the error margin. And that dotted line is impossible to know where it is because it doesn't give you tangible results like the hard line, which says, oops, we've had an accident. So we perceive where that line is. Now, there is management pressure, and that could be, from a dive center, a dive club. It could be your own management. It could be your internal management, or it could be an organization. What we're trying to do is be as efficient as possible. Humans love being efficient because we save energy. It's great. So anything that we can do more efficiently, if that means cutting corners and we don't have an accident, hey, that's cool. Because actually to do the right thing requires mental effort as well as physical effort. And I'll touch on this point on the very last slide. So the other bit is we want to be as efficient as possible. So we have a finite amount of money. How do we make it go further? And that might be about not servicing our equipment in the timescales because we haven't used it much. It could be about using cheaper gas. So it could be using air instead of trimix. Or it could be eroding our gas limits because that saves us some money. We can get more of a dive because if I end the dive with, say, 80 bar, well, that's like just under half of the pressure. I could have got a little bit longer out of that. So we gradually erode those margins. And then we have the sort of the safety campaigns, which is this way, the stuff that the DANs that are out there, Southern Africa, Europe and America, Japan, and the stuff that I do, it's about trying to reduce accidents. So we're pushing back against the other way. Now, the difficulty in diving is statistically, it's pretty safe, especially when we look at fatalities. 1 in 200,000 dives. Well, I'm never going to do 200,000 dives. Therefore, I'm not going to die while I go diving. Now, that might appear to be a really stupid way of looking at risk, but that's the mental shortcuts that we take. We don't hear about things, therefore, they're not in our viewpoint. So we don't necessarily think they apply to us. So those tensions are there all the time. Now, moving to Snook's piece about practical drift. And what he showed was that within complex organizations, which are called tightly coupled, where you have tight margins. So if somebody makes a mistake, there isn't a lot of time to catch it before it propagates through the system. So you end up like a sort of a domino effect, but it's more a systems view rather than a chain of events. Now, what he pointed out was this concept that each person or each group has a certain amount of margin. So you have a design point, which is the bottom baseline, the global rule baseline that says, this is how we operate. But once you have lots and lots of different organizations interacting, each one of those has a little bit of a margin that you're dealing with. Now, everybody can use almost up to their margin, and those different units or subunits have got different amounts of margin to play with. So subunit 1 has got that much margin and they've used nearly all the way up to it. Subunit 2, and this is what the image, has used a little bit, has used some more. Now, each one of those organizations, sub-organizations, thinks they're operating safely. Now, what happened in the shoot down and happens in lots of other occasions when you start applying hindsight, you look back, is people erode the capacity they have and they've created by the shortcuts, the tolerances that you're taking away. And it's only when things come together that instead of having little changes, you now have this huge delta And it's like, oh, and this is why, again, we go back to this point that one mistake is not enough. One mistake might be enough to kick that domino in a tightly coupled system and join everything together. Now, it could be on another day, you are 99% using up the total margins and you're still fine because you haven't created a reflective environment where you go back and debrief things. Part of that then I'm going to look is, how do we make the decisions we do? Sorry, my dog just jumped to the window, which is wondering what that noise was. How we make decisions. Well, there's first one is I had some stimulus, which then went, what's that pattern matching? Look down. That's a decision. The fact that I had very little control over what happens is part of the problem, and it's part of the solution we have as individuals. Now, there are, and I think I talked about this I think it was the last presentation, human information processing model, how we take information in, how we process it sort of subconsciously, then it goes into our working memories, and then we start to compare it to our long-term memories and our expectations and our goals. And all of the time, we're dropping little bits of information, and then, we deal with something, we encode it. And when we encode it, we add errors. Our memories are not like video cameras or stills cameras that capture the information as we see it. What they do is they approximate it, encode it with a whole bunch of emotional and social information and some tags that help us bring it back out again. Now, each time we bring it back out, we use it and we tell a story. Talk about a dive that happened, and you'll hear over time that the stories change. And that's not being done maliciously. That's because when we tell that story, it's corrupted when it came out of our brains. We tell it, and then when we re-encode it, because we don't leave it there, we re-encode it, we add some more noise and errors to that model. So we keep on restoring the poor information, and so this is how your brain works. I've just had a thought process. When I was a kid, would have been 86, 87, 88, somewhere around about there. I had a ZX Spectrum computer and used to load them from audio cassettes. Now, I don't know the age of the audience in here, but some people might, what on earth are you on about? So we used to, the games were bought on audio cassettes. And then you'd pirate them, you'd copy them with your friends. And so you'd put them in a tape deck, a double tape deck, and you'd put a microphone cable across, and you'd play and you'd record. And when you recorded, you added errors onto the magnetic tape. So you'd then take this tape and you'd give it to somebody else, and they'd record it, and you'd add more errors. And you get to the stage where you play this thing and you'd spend 20 minutes loading a game. So this bit about, my computer's taking 5 seconds to load something, 20 minutes to load a game, and then it would go error. It's like, oh, what? And you've got to put it back in again. So that happens when we are processing our own information, and we end up making those sorts of mistakes. The next bit is System 1 and System 2. And this is work from Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, looking at this dual mode way of looking at the world. And System 1 is fast, intuitive, incredibly efficient, and we probably use it somewhere in the sort of 95, 98% of the time. And System 2 is slow, logical, methodical, and uses a lot of mental energy. And I go back to that bit about being efficient earlier. We don't like to spend mental energy doing stuff, and our brain consumes a considerable amount of our calorific intake. So we try to use System 1, and it's based on cognitive biases. We have seen stuff before, we pattern match, and it's great. And biases are brilliant. I mean, I did some work out in the oil industry, and one of the guys said, I'm going to stop doing System 1 behavior. And I went, you're not. You need it. It's how we operate on autopilot to navigate the world we do. So biases are often seen as a negative thing, but in reality, they're really good. And what we have to do if we're going to make better decisions is to try and slow down when we're in a critical situation, whereby we use something like a checklist or a peer check or a cross check with somebody else. And another way of making decisions is this genuine pattern matching process. And this is where experience and expertise comes, because each time you encounter something, especially different, you start to build mental models. And we have these cues and clues that lead us to say, do this, an action script. Now that do this is based on our previous experiences and patterns that we've built up over time. The more experience we've got, the more patterns we've got, the faster we can make more those decisions, and the more reliable those decisions are. And we shouldn't be surprised when people are put in novel environments where they are trying to follow a process, but it doesn't match the pattern. And then we get into something called satisficing, a best guess. And when we're in that mode of operations, our failure rate is in the order of 1 in 2 to 1 in 10. And this is why experience becomes so important, and not just the same thing, but diverse experience. And if you're in a team, having cognitive diversity, not just surface diversity, in terms of race, color, creed, gender, all of those bits that we can see. What we're talking about here is how to look at a problem differently. And that's the sort of what we're going to talk about in terms of the cognitive biases. Now, these biases that limit our learning are the three of them that I'm going to cover, or in fact, 4 of them that I'm going to cover. And Mornay, if you can drop the camera and just put me on full screen. The idea here for this hindsight bias is that we can easily join the dots afterwards. So if I'm going to draw a series of squares and talk through it as we go along. So I've got an activity and I've got 4 choices that I can look at, and the light is there. I'm sorry about that. Now that choice at the top has got 4 choices, and this one has 4 choices as well. Now I'm not going to draw them all in, but from that point there, that one line, if I go 3 tiers in, I've got 64 different options at each, if I go to that line. So I don't know what the future looks like. And, the encounters we have, there are lots of different choices. But if something happens here, I can immediately go, oh yeah, it's that, it's that, it's that. You know what? That was a rubbish decision. Now, there is a quote, and I'm just going to bring it up here. He says, from Hidden QC, who's at Queen's Counsel, and he talked about a train crash at Ladbroke Grove, where a train driver drove through a red light. It's called signal passing at danger. And in his report, he wrote, "There is almost no action or decision that cannot be made to look flawed in the misleading light of hindsight. It is essential that the critic should keep himself constantly aware of that fact." You have an understanding of what happened. You can now join the dots, and it may be glaringly obvious to you now, with all those facts, that that was a bum decision. But that person at that time did not know with 100% certainty what the future was going to look like. They're making the best judgment they can, given the information they have, their experience, their knowledge, the equipment, and dealing with the goals and pressures. So we go back to that Air India crash. It was this bit of, we've got to get back. We're taking some people who were repatriating COVID, people who were trying to get back into India before they closed the borders. There were time pressures involved, because if they didn't land in that time, then they were going to run over. And so they wouldn't be able to do the next schedule. In the case of Brian, there were pressures there to get the dive done. And that led to shortcuts. In hindsight, it led to shortcuts. But in real time, it made sense. So if we go back to the slides now, Mornay, please. So the next one is outcome. There are 2 here that are closely linked. Outcome and severity bias. So outcome bias is where we end up with a negative outcome, and we look at that in and it draws our attention, or something went wrong, therefore we draw our attention. But how often do things go right? how often do we look at the things that go right and then say, how do we get better? And so once we've drawn our attention to this event because it's had a bad outcome, we will then judge it more harshly because of severity bias. And what this is if somebody dies, we judge it really harshly. If somebody has a near miss with a bit of an injury, well, we don't necessarily judge it quite so harshly. And if we have a near miss where people just brush it off and went, that's fine, then we just pretty much ignore it. And you could look at this at, say, gas management, and going back to Mornay's little guide, how not to run out of gas. This bit of, if somebody ends the dive with 30 bar, which is below, what they were expected, then we might think, well, that's a bit low. If that person surfaces with 0 gas, we might judge them a bit more harshly. Or it might be that those dive centers who are saying, look, you're paying for your gas. Hey, well done. You've got a full tank's worth of a dive out of that. You've got no contingency, but well done. Now, if somebody runs out of gas at sort of near the end and they make a rapid ascent and they get DCS, well, we'll probably judge them quite harshly. And then if they run out of gas and they die, hey, well, how could you run out of gas? Well, hang on a minute. The process and the reasons why they ran out of gas could be identical, but we're judging based on the outcomes. And then the fundamental attribution bias is this want and this tendency to focus on individual dispositional information. So it might be about my temperament, about my knowledge. It might be about stuff that's inside me, being a fool or stupid or not paying attention, compared to situational attribution, which is the context, and understanding how it made sense for me to do what I did based on the context and the operating environment that I'm in. I might not have had some useful training. It might have been a tick and flick course. There we go. Here's your card. And in fact, I heard a story this week where 2 students had been given their open water cards, but been told that they weren't safe divers. And they went to a colleague of mine, and they sort of said, well, we're not going diving anymore. It's just like, why? Well, because our instructors said that we're not safe to dive. But you got given your cards. Yeah. Right. Okay. So, and that instructor was potentially issuing cards to get certification numbers to move up the ladder. So we need to look at the wider context that's going on. Now, this is where we move into something called the cheesy world of the Swiss cheese model. And I'm going to show you 3 videos that which are available on the Human Diver Vimeo channel. If you want to use them in any of your presentations, feel free. They've got little tags for the Human Diver on there. I don't have a problem with that at all. It's the same with pretty much all of the materials that I've got out there. So start off with, I'll show there's no sound for these. I'm going to be over here. I'm off the edge of the screen. Haha, this is the fun of operating this. There we go. Right. So what we've got there are a number of layers in terms of how we create safety. We've got organizational influence. We've got supervision. Then we've got how do we set ourselves up for success? And then those human errors that we're talking about, human errors and violations. Now, because those layers are made by humans, they will have holes in them. Now, when I created this video, I wanted to get I'm going to put it there. Put it there and pause it. Is that I wanted the animator to open and close these holes because they're not always there. They're created and they open and they close based on what's happening. And as it says here, the difficulty is knowing what's happened further up the chain. So I make an assumption, as we do, we make lots of assumptions, that the person to the left of me in time, and that could be an organization, it could be an instructor, it could be a dive center manager, they've done their job properly. And so if I make a mistake, oh, it's okay, because everything else is fine. They're doing their job properly, and there's enough fat in the system, we go to that practical drift bit, that if I make a mistake, then it will be caught because we've planned and dealt with those things. Now, it could be that you're the instructor further back in time and you think, yeah, well, the agency might, the agency have done their job. I've made a mistake teaching my student, but the student will pick up that error. So that's the difficulty about left and right in time and the assumptions that we make. Now, this is shown as a linear model, and there is a phrase from George Box which says all models are wrong and some are useful. So there are limits to how you can use this model. It's almost universal in application, but you've got to understand its limitations. And because there are limitations, and because this shows things almost as a linear process, I created a couple of other little models. And I'm going to move on to the next slide. There we go. Is instead of having 4 layers, one after another, I created 4 balls. They're like little plastic balls when you're at school playing tennis or cricket, things like that. So instead of having a layered model, what we've got is 4 spheres, one inside of each other, that basically have, hang on, turn that off. I didn't plan that one properly. So those layers have got holes, and they take lots and lots of little dots, and it takes 4 of them to make an accident, an adverse event. And so what we do is we look at this and we say, look at that. We've got obvious factors, but those same 4 factors that are visible actually were present beforehand anyway. So the idea is to try and minimize the impact that these happen. So we can have lots and lots of little things come together in an emergent fashion. Now, at the same time, you can also have a large hole in the system. And this is where it's a little bit obvious. Similar situation. So we've got these 4 layers, they're spinning around and they're putting energy on the target in the middle. This bit that says once it's reached a critical mass, it goes bang. And we don't know where and when that's going to be, which is why we should be doing as much as we can to be as high performing as we can, because we don't know when those things are all going to come together. Now, as I said, both of those have got limitations, and people go, God, that's really complex. How on earth do I deal with that? How do I, that's a really abstract term. Well, the best thing is to do the best you can with everything you've got, because you never know what's going to happen in terms of stuff that's happening back and forth. Now, it's not just the environment, physical environment. What we also got to look at is what's going on in our brains, what's influencing us to make decisions and to take risks. And one of the things that I did 2 weeks ago, I ran a little research project, and I'm a fair way behind where I wanted to be for this, but I'm going to share a little bit tonight. I'm going to share a little bit more on Saturday at the conference. And the goal is to produce a research paper that looks at this in more detail. And it could end up being the basis for a future PhD as well. Now, the point here is that our behavior is a function of the environment we're in and the person we are. So it's called Lewin's equation, which is why when modern safety, or fairly recent safety, has all been about behavior-based safety, about fixing the worker or fixing the diver, when actually, if we don't address the environment in which they're operating, they're diving, or the social environment, things like that, we're going to have limited impact. And we've got to look further than just the individual. So this little exercise we did, I got 9 divers of varying experiences from around the globe to sit in on a virtual whiteboard session. And we ran two workshops. One was 3 hours long and another one was an hour and a half long. And on the first one, we had a question that said, what is it that influences divers to make the decisions they did? And out of the 9 of us, we created about 300 Post-it notes of stuff. Now, there's some duplication in there, but the idea is that you get a cognitively diverse view. And I'm going to cover that on the next slide, or next one slide. And we got some ideas, and people looking at them going, wow, I wouldn't have thought of that. And that's the benefit of doing this sort of group brainstorming ideas. We then looked at something called RIT, what influences divers to take the risks they do, because diving is all about risk management or uncertainty management, because we're trying to make things as certain as possible and control things as much as we can. So I'm going to cross here. This was the risk one. And we just collected all these, and we had about 15 minutes writing lots of Post-it notes. And we had a little bit of a session at the end. And the idea is you start to synthesize or aggregate these ideas. And what we came up with was these sorts of topics: a physical state of the individual, in effect, their fitness, and their equippedness, I suppose, for the activity. Mental state: what was going on in their head? Were they set up for what was going on? What about their personality? Were they risk-seeking or risk-averse? Were they logical or they're emotional? Those impact people's decisions. The communication into the individual and the communication out. I mean, communication is a huge topic. Internal pressures. So it's that bit that says, how do I feel that I'm going to do something? What are my obligations? And then there's the external pressures, and that might be time, it might be visibility, it might be current, it might be the weather, those sorts of things. Experience and expertise, and the concept of going from a novice, where you are very rules-based and you expect the novices to apply those rules, through to experts, where actually we expect them to do things differently and think of their own, and they're thinking outside the box. But when things go wrong, we still blame the experts for not behaving like a novice. But the expert never behaves like a novice, because they've got a different way of looking at that. And if anybody wants to look some more, Dreyfus and Dreyfus is the models that they're at. Storytelling experience, and that might be about your experience of sharing with somebody else about something going wrong, or if something that's gone, you've made a mistake in the past, it's hit social media, and now you're in that situation going, you know what, I'm not going to take that risk again. I don't want to either speak up and challenge somebody, or I don't want to try and push my limits, make a mistake, and then be subject to social media pressure. And then the final one is the technology. What is helping or hindering somebody? If you've got a rebreather and you're trained up on it, you understand it, you're going to expose yourself to greater risks than you would have done if you were on, say, open circuit. So understanding all of these factors is really important. And there's a lot more than we cover in about 3 or 4 minutes. So how do we address this notion of it's just one thing when it's not? Well, there's a number of bits there. First off is recognition of human performance variability. Now, that's a better way of saying errors. The problem with errors is that sometimes errors are positive, and sometimes they're negative. You can say that an error is an unintended deviation from a preferred behavior. Well, that could also be innovation. So understand that our variability is great, but it can catch us out. And that's the problem, which we want to have stuff in little boxes. We want to have the control. Learning-based investigations. And this is the work predominantly of Ivan Pupilidi and the US Forest Service, and changing how they moved from the Serious Accident Investigation Board, which was very much about blame and identifying individuals. It said it was learning, but it was very much focused on adherence to rules and violations of the standards and things that were there. Whereas they brought in this learning review, which said, how does it make sense for people to do what they do in normal work? And then what was the deviation from there to accidents? Because accidents are deviations from normal work. Now, that normal work might include the rules, but we're managing that capacity. Again, we go back to that multiple layers of practical drift. We have our own ways of doing things. And what we're trying to work out is, how are we managing that capacity? Having a cognitively diverse perspective, or having perspectives that are there, because each one of us will look differently at this. And in fact, tomorrow, on Saturday, Dave Conlin is going to be talking about his experience of being subject to investigation following a near fatal dive. And he's comparing his events to the Cuban Missile Crisis. He's like, what? That's way out there. It's a brilliant way of looking at the decision making that goes on. And I'm not going to steal his thunder on that. The next bit, education and leadership, is this bit that we have to educate people. We've got to give them the ideas of what's involved in decision making, in teamwork, in communication, in situation awareness, and how to run learning investigations. And that's, I'm running a course. I start, it's a month now actually, the first trial of a learning-based investigation, or investigation's even the wrong word. What we're trying to do is a learning review rather than an investigation, because the language makes a big difference. So educating stakeholders within the dive community that said, actually, we can learn from this. And the US Forest Service, when they put learning reviews in, and they got rid of the serious accident investigation boards, their learning went up big time and their litigation went down, because they involved the families in developing and the survivors in developing the learning products that went out. And the learning products were targeted for each sort of stakeholder group. So it might be a frontline operator, it might be a frontline supervisor, it might be a middle management, it might be the executive board. Each one of them had a slightly different product that's there. And the leadership is really, it's not about positions, it's about people like you and me that are here leading the way. The fact that you're on this webinar is fantastic. You are an innovator, because there are far fewer people out there. You are the minority. There are loads of people who would get this, but I'm going to read out a little thing later on in that last slide when I stop sharing, because it's in my notes. I'm going to read it out verbatim. That actually it's quite difficult, and this is also a little bit of an uncomfortable statement to consider. So what do I do in terms of that educational process? So Mornay and I have discussed the conference that starts tomorrow, the 0900 UTC, so 10 o'clock UK. There's a time converter on the website that allows you to see when those are. It's short notice, it's the night before, it's 2 full days. It's 8 hours a day in 2 conference halls with 30 different presentations covering multiple aspects of human factors and how it applies to diving. And it's not just divers that are presenting either. I've got the ex-head of safety culture from British Petroleum, a lady called Diane Chadwick-Jones, who is going to present on how BP changed their approach to learning and applying and developing a better, just culture, so that they could learn from the near misses. And what they found is that nearly all of the events that they investigated had systemic problems at their genesis, not the human error that was associated, that was there. The book that I've written is 30 plus stories from divers, giving you practical advice to embody this within your own diving. The website itself, The Human Diver, and the concept of counter-errorism in diving. There are lots of programs out there. And on Sunday night, the new Essentials class will be released, which is basically takes over from where the micro class was. And the investigation course will be available before the end of the year. Probably in November is going to run the first one. And it'll be 4 half days remote delivered. Because, hey, I can reach a much wider audience globally than trying to run a physical workshop where either I have to travel or you, which is somewhat limiting. And then the If Only documentary, which is available to download. There's a workbook you can download, and you can run your own little workshops there. And all the instructions are in the guide. So that's my sort of final bit. And if I stop sharing, I'm going to read what's in the notes from that presentation that I was talking about. I'm just going to end the show. I got emailed this today, and it was really about the challenge in trying to bring human factors into the diving world. And I had a quote a couple of years ago, said the problem with trying to bring human factors into diving is human factors. And so this person wrote in and said, in an Instagram social media world, it's easy for people to say they're discussing things that might have gone wrong. It makes for a catchy self-promotional statement, but doing the work to actually apply the ideas and principles takes effort and work. It requires small businesses, speaking from a local dive shop perspective, to challenge all they know, especially if they're tied into a diving agency that's a slow ship to turn around. It's worked so far, right? I know this is probably an oversimplification, but it's basically easy to try and promote oneself as an HF, a human factors conscious diver or pro. It's another thing to apply it and put one's money to attend something like your conference. And it doesn't just apply to the conference. What I write in the front cover of all the books that I sign and send out, and it's a quote from J.W. Goethe, knowledge is not enough, we must apply. Willing is not enough, we must do. And that is hard because the perceived change that we require to create change, we have to perceive 1.5 to 2.5 times the benefit before we even consider doing something about it. So that's why change is really hard for something like this, because you are turning your own super tanker and you have to have a very good mindset. And you are, by being here, watching this, a long way towards that. So thank you very much. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Well, Gareth, thank you very much. As always, great content and loads to think about. And after that, try and implement. I did see a question from Stefan earlier. I just want to try.
Yeah, I've seen that. Have you used the Six Sigma methodology to analyze issues? I haven't. However, I know people who have and say it doesn't work because it doesn't take into account the social or cultural aspects of accidents. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong. It just might have limitations. And given what I'm already trying to learn, I'm not going to go down there. I know nothing of it, and here's a bias being shown through. I have heard Six Sigma described as Sick Sigma instead of six, because it's not got a great reputation with systems engineers. So,
yeah,
brilliant. Thank you, Evie Zai. I don't know how you pronounce that. Sorry. Brilliant. And to that end, all of those people who've got existing essentials classes, the micro classes, you'll get sent a form. So there's about 1,800 people subscribed to that course. Not all of them have paid for it. They've got them through prizes and trying to get people interested in it. If you're a member of that microclass, you'll get an email, and basically as a filter to see how committed you are is all I want is a little bit of feedback, and then you'll get access to the new essentials class that will go live on Sunday, which is a much better product. It's taken me 5 years to do it. I've learned a whole bunch more, and this is a much better product. So for those who've already got a microclass, you'll get it. You just need to send a little bit and show some commitment to go from there. So I don't want to rehand it out. So thank you for that, Evie.
Yeah, Gareth, just while we're chatting, I've left a bunch of links to all your resources and so forth, and I'll also add a link now as we continue to those courses, so people can just explore those if they haven't seen it yet.
So it's just /training will get you to the courses. Thank you, George.
Yeah, all right.
Excellent. Well, as someone likes to spend a lot of time on pre-dive planning debriefing, any suggestions what the bullet points to focus on when doing them? So the debrief is dead easy. If you go humandiver/debrief, you'll get a guide for that. And in terms of the pre-dive planning, I have got another worksheet which is talks about United, and I'll put a PDF together for that, and I'll post it after this call for Mornay to send out.
Okay. All right, great stuff. Let's see. Another great presentation. So yeah, lots of compliments there. I don't know if there are any additional questions.
Jerry, so how does failure failure mode element analysis is, I've seen that it works in a mechanical way. As I understand it, I don't know a lot about it. What I do know is that it is very much set up about mechanical interactions and failure systems and failure modes. So if you look at the Open Safety website, they've got a FMEA for a rebreather. And that is very much about the technical interactions that happen within the system. As I understand it, FMEA doesn't deal with social, cultural aspects or cognitive aspects of a system and a failure modes within it. Hopefully that answered that one, Jerry.
Okay. Ian says, thanks for a great presentation. Megan, thank you. Very informative. Well, there we go. So if anybody still has any questions for Gareth, please pop them in there. From my side, Gareth, as always, thank you very much for your time. Looking forward to the conference. For those folks, if you haven't bought your tickets, go look at the website, see what the conference is all about if you're not sure yet, and have a look.
You'll see Beatrice. You'll see Beatrice on Saturday. She's talking about miscommunication. If communication was so easy, why is it that we have so much miscommunication out there?
Yeah, exactly. Great topic. That I love that. Yeah. Anyways, okay. Well, so it seems like no more questions. Just lots of thanks and time. So, Gareth, I think we'll let you off the hook for now.
Great.
I'm sure you've got some preps to do for the conference.
Oh yeah, still stuff to do.
Yeah, best of luck, and looking forward to it. So thank you for your time, and for everybody that joined. As always, great to have you on board, and thanks for your support.
Take care. Thanks very much, everybody.
All right. Good night. Cheers everybody,
bye.
wherever you are.